I'm not taking care of that old witch. The whisper sliced cleanly through the hush of the chapel, louder than the organ, sharper than the winter air drifting in each time the heavy wooden doors opened. Margaret Whitmore stood 3 feet from her son's casket, her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist, her spine straight despite the weight pressing against her ribs. The lilies were arranged in a careful arc of white and pale green, their scent thick enough to taste, and the polished oak gleamed under the soft church lights. Ethan's photograph rested beside the flowers, his easy smile forever frozen at 38. A few rows back, Lindsay Whitmore leaned toward a cousin, her black dress immaculate, her mascara untouched by tears. She didn't lower her voice enough. A couple of heads shifted. Someone cleared their throat. But no one said a word. Margaret heard it all. She did not turn around. She did not blink. Instead, she adjusted the cuff of her coat, smoothing the wool as if she were preparing for a board meeting rather than burying her only child. The minister's voice continued, steady and measured, speaking of kindness and legacy, of a man who worked hard and loved deeply. Margaret kept her gaze on the casket, tracing the brass handles with her eyes. She remembered polishing Ethan's first pair of dress shoes before his high school graduation, remembered standing in the driveway of this very church 20 years earlier, waving as he drove off to college in a used sedan she had paid for in cash. Outside, the February wind rattled the stained glass panels, and the light fractured into muted reds and blues across the pews. Lindsay shifted again, checking her phone for a brief second before sliding it back into her clutch. There was calculation in the way she scanned the room, as if measuring sympathy, estimating who might take her side later. Margaret's jaw tightened just slightly, the only sign that the words had landed. She knew what the congregation believed, that she would move into the big colonial house in Westchester, that Lindsay would take care of her, that grief would make her pliable. They did not know the mortgage statements never bore Lindsay's name. They did not know the property taxes had been wired from Margaret's account every December for the past 7 years. The final hymn began, soft and wavering, and everyone rose. Margaret stepped forward when it was her turn, placing a single white rose on the casket. Her fingertips lingered for a breath, not in desperation, but in promise. When she finally turned to leave, she walked past Lindsay without acknowledgement. Her heels clicked once, twice, steady against the marble floor. She did not need to defend herself. She did not need to answer the whisper. Grief had taken her son. It would not take her dignity. And somewhere beneath the quiet sorrow in her eyes, something else settled into place, calm, deliberate, and unshakably certain. The reception hall smelled faintly of brewed coffee and polished wood, a softer echo of the chapel's restraint, and Margaret Whitmore moved through it as though she were walking across thin ice, careful, composed, unwilling to crack. Paper plates balanced slices of store-bought pound cake, and small clusters of guests formed polite circles, their voices lowered into respectful murmurs that never quite reached sincerity. Lindsay stood near the wide bay window overlooking the gray February lawn, her posture relaxed now, her hand resting lightly on the back of a dining chair as if she were already claiming territory. She accepted condolences with a controlled nod, her expression shifting easily between sadness and something more practical. When an older neighbor asked what would happen next, Lindsay gave a tight smile and said that she supposed she would have a great deal to manage, the house, the bills, the arrangements, and perhaps eventually she would consider selling and starting fresh somewhere warmer, maybe Florida, somewhere with less maintenance and fewer memories. Margaret heard her name mentioned twice, spoken gently, followed by phrases like temporary arrangements and helping out. She stirred her tea without drinking it, watching the spoon circle the porcelain cup, the faint clink steady and unhurried. The house Lindsay referred to stood on 2 acres in Westchester County, a white colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch Ethan had loved since childhood. The oak tree in the front yard had once held a tire swing Margaret had tied herself on a summer afternoon when Ethan was 8 years old. That property had never been a gift. It had been an investment, purchased quietly after Ethan married, when interest rates were low and Lindsay insisted they needed more space. Margaret remembered the day she signed the closing documents in a small conference room. Downtown, the fluorescent lights humming above as she initialed each page with deliberate strokes. She had not asked for recognition. She had only asked for peace. Across the room, Lindsay laughed softly at something a friend whispered, the sound bright enough to draw attention. She glanced toward Margaret briefly, her eyes scanning, assessing, then turning away again. Someone approached Margaret and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering to help her pack a few things later if she planned to move in with Lindsay for a while. Margaret thanked her kindly and said she had not made any decisions yet. Her voice was steady, almost serene. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the house at 25 miles per hour, tires humming against damp pavement, indifferent to grief or gossip. The afternoon light began to fade earlier than it had a month ago, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Margaret set her untouched tea on the side table and walked slowly toward the hallway where family photos lined the walls, Ethan at 10 with a baseball glove, Ethan at 22 in a graduation cap, Ethan at 35 standing on the porch of this very house. She paused in front of the last frame, her reflection faintly overlapping his smile in the glass. In the living room behind her, Lindsay's voice carried again, confident now, speaking of logistics, timelines, and what made the most financial sense. Margaret listened without turning around. Grief had taken many things from her in the past week, but clarity was not one of them. 3 days after the reception, the house grew quieter than anyone expected, the kind of quiet that made the ticking of the hallway clock sound like a hammer against drywall. Margaret Whitmore arrived just after 9 in the morning, her sedan pulling into the circular driveway at exactly 15 miles per hour, tires crunching softly over leftover gravel from the winter salting. The sky hung low and pale, and the front porch still carried the faint scent of extinguished candles from the vigil Lindsay had arranged the night before. Inside, cardboard boxes sat half-assembled on the dining room table, and a legal pad covered in Lindsay's handwriting listed items under headings like sell, donate, and keep. Lindsay stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, wearing a long sweater and an expression of focused efficiency. She looked up, surprised. But not unsettled. She had assumed Margaret would call first. Margaret removed her gloves slowly and placed them on the entryway console beside a ceramic bowl that had once held Ethan's car keys. She did not comment on the boxes. She did not ask what was being packed. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen, where the coffee maker still blinked 12 o'clock in stubborn red numbers. Lindsay followed, her tone polite but edged with impatience, explaining that she had started organizing because it was practical to think ahead, because carrying 2 mortgages was unrealistic, because maintenance on 2 acres required time and money. Margaret listened, her gaze moving over the marble countertops she had chosen herself 7 years earlier, the brushed nickel fixtures she had paid for without mentioning it at Thanksgiving dinner. She opened the pantry and ran her fingertips along the shelf where Ethan used to stack cereal boxes in uneven towers. The house had never belonged to chance. Every nail, every hinge, every property tax payment wired each December had passed quietly through Margaret's hands. Lindsay spoke of market value, estimating that with current listings in Westchester they could expect a strong return, perhaps enough to relocate comfortably, perhaps enough to simplify life. Margaret turned on the faucet and filled a glass of water, the sound steady and controlled. She took a measured sip before setting the glass down on a linen coaster embroidered with the family name. When Lindsay finished outlining her plan, she paused, waiting for agreement. Margaret finally met her eyes, calm and unreadable, and said that no decisions should be rushed. The probate process required patience, and paperwork should be reviewed carefully before assumptions were made. Lindsay's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She insisted that Ethan had told her the house was theirs, that everything had been built together. Margaret nodded once, neither confirming nor denying. She walked toward the hallway again, stopping at the thermostat Ethan had installed himself one summer afternoon when the old system failed during a 90-degree heat wave. Her reflection appeared faintly in the brushed metal surface, steady and composed. Behind her, Lindsay's voice softened, suggesting that perhaps Margaret might consider moving in for a while, that it would be easier for everyone if arrangements were streamlined. Margaret adjusted the thermostat by 2 degrees and said she preferred to keep her own schedule. Outside, a real estate agent's car drove slowly past the property, scouting neighborhoods, unaware that the ground beneath those white pillars held more history and more documentation than anyone inside the house was prepared to acknowledge. Margaret picked up her gloves again, her movements deliberate, and as she reached the front door she glanced once more at the staircase Ethan used to descend 2 steps at a time. Grief still lived in the corners of her eyes, but beneath it lay something firmer than sorrow, something built on signatures and dates and a truth that had never required applause. 1 week later, Margaret Whitmore returned to the house with a slim leather folder tucked beneath her arm, the kind she had carried into conference rooms for more than 30 years, and she parked in the driveway as if she had every right to be there because she did. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the porch columns, and through the front window she could see movement, Lindsay pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh cleaning spray and ambition. A stack of glossy real estate brochures lay on the kitchen counter, each one featuring wide-angle photographs of homes with phrases like prime opportunity and move-in ready printed in confident lettering. Lindsay ended her call as Margaret stepped fully into the room, surprise flashing across her face before settling into a tight smile. She explained that she had only been gathering information, that it was smart to understand the market, that houses in Westchester were selling quickly and buyers were paying in cash. Margaret placed her leather folder carefully on the dining table beside the half-assembled boxes and ran her hand once along the polished surface, feeling the grain of the wood she had chosen years earlier from a catalog. She did not look at the brochures. She did not comment on the staging notes Lindsay had scribbled in the margins. Instead, she opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper, then another, aligning their corners with quiet precision. The documents were crisp, each page marked with signatures and dates that told a story more durable than conversation. Lindsay's eyes flickered downward despite herself. Margaret spoke evenly, explaining that before any discussions about listing or relocation could continue, there were details that required clarification. She mentioned property records filed with the county clerk's office, mortgage statements addressed solely to her name, and annual tax payments drafted from an account Lindsay had never accessed. The words were not delivered as accusations. They were delivered as facts. The room seemed to narrow slightly, the ticking clock above the refrigerator suddenly louder. Lindsay insisted that Ethan had handled the finances, that she had trusted him, that surely everything had been shared. Margaret listened without interruption. She remembered sitting across from Ethan at this very table 2 years earlier when he admitted he had never transferred ownership because it was simpler that way. She remembered nodding, not because she doubted him, but because she preferred paperwork to promises. Outside, a light breeze lifted the American flag at the edge of the lawn, its fabric snapping once against the pole. Margaret slid the top document across the table so Lindsay could see the heading clearly, the bold letters spelling out deed and sole owner. She did not lean forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply allowed the silence to stretch until the truth settled into the space between them. Lindsay's fingers tightened around the back of a dining chair, her earlier confidence thinning into calculation. Margaret gathered the remaining pages and placed them back into the folder with unhurried care. She explained that no realtor would be walking through the front door, no sign would be planted in the yard, and no open house would be scheduled without her consent. Then she closed the folder, the soft click of the clasp echoing more firmly than any argument could have. In that quiet kitchen, beneath recessed lighting she had personally approved down to the wattage, Margaret did not look like someone waiting to be taken care of. She looked like the owner of every inch of ground beneath her feet. The silence after the papers were revealed did not explode into shouting, it thickened, like humidity before a summer storm. Lindsay stared at the dining table as though the wood itself had betrayed her, her reflection faint in its polished surface. Margaret Whitmore remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her posture unshaken. Outside, a delivery truck slowed to 20 miles per hour before turning the corner, unaware that the balance of the household had shifted entirely within those white walls. Lindsay finally spoke, her voice measured but strained, saying there must have been a misunderstanding, that Ethan would never have kept something so important from her. Margaret did not argue about what Ethan would or would not have done. She simply reached into the leather folder once more and removed a smaller envelope, the paper slightly worn at the edges from careful handling. She placed it on the table between them and slid it forward. Inside was a copy of an updated will, signed 2 years earlier in a quiet law office in downtown White Plains. Margaret remembered the day clearly. Ethan had worn a navy sweater and looked tired but certain. He had said he wanted clarity, not confusion, and he had thanked his mother for always thinking ahead. Lindsay opened the envelope with fingers that no longer appeared steady. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly at first, then more slowly, as certain phrases settled into place. Primary residence. Sole ownership. Temporary occupancy not to exceed 30 calendar days in the event of his passing. The clock above the stove ticked once, twice, marking time with impartial rhythm. Margaret watched without satisfaction, without cruelty. She had not created the clause. She had only honored it. Lindsay's shoulders straightened as she reached the final page, where Ethan's signature curved confidently across the bottom. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of wind moving across the 2-acre property outside. Lindsay asked what this meant, her voice quieter now. Margaret answered calmly that it meant there would be time to gather belongings, to make plans, to find a new beginning somewhere that truly belonged to her. It meant there would be no open houses, no sudden sales, no assumptions made in the shadow of grief. It meant the house would remain exactly where it had always stood, under the ownership of the woman who had purchased it. Margaret closed the folder and placed it back beneath her arm. She walked toward the front window and looked out at the oak tree in the yard, its branches bare but strong against the late winter sky. She remembered tying that tire swing with her own hands, measuring the rope twice to make sure it would hold. Behind her, Lindsay remained at the table, the papers spread before her like a map that had just been redrawn. Margaret did not offer comfort. She did not offer apology. She simply turned back toward the room and said that she would coordinate with attorney Daniel Brooks to ensure everything proceeded respectfully and according to the law. Then she walked toward the door, her heels steady against the hardwood floor. The house did not feel hostile. It felt grounded. And for the first time since the funeral, Margaret allowed herself a slow, steady breath, knowing that grief could not strip her of what had been carefully built, documented, and protected long before anyone had thought to question her place within those walls. 30 days is a precise number when it is written in legal language, and it began counting the moment Margaret Whitmore stepped out of the house with the leather folder secured beneath her arm. The next morning, she met attorney Daniel Brooks in his corner office overlooking Main Street in White Plains, where traffic moved steadily below at 30 miles per hour and life continued without hesitation. Daniel reviewed the documents once more, his silver-framed glasses resting low on his nose, and confirmed that the clause was clear, enforceable, and deliberate. Margaret listened without emotion, her hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany desk. She did not ask if Lindsay would be upset. She asked only about timelines, written notices, and the appropriate tone for formal communication. By noon, a certified letter had been drafted, outlining the 30 calendar days of temporary occupancy and the expectation that the property would be vacated respectfully and completely. That afternoon, Lindsay received the envelope at the front door, signing for it with a tight expression as the postal carrier stood patiently on the porch. Inside, she unfolded the letter slowly, reading each line twice. The house felt larger than it had before, the ceilings higher, the rooms more distant. Margaret did not return that day. She allowed space to do its work. Over the next week, small changes appeared. Cardboard boxes multiplied in the hallway. Closet doors remained open. The guest bedroom filled with neatly stacked belongings labeled in black marker. Lindsay moved through the rooms with controlled urgency, making phone calls about apartments, storage units, and short-term leases within a 20-mile radius. She spoke with friends about unexpected complications and legal technicalities, careful not to mention the whispered comment at the funeral that still lingered in memory. Margaret visited only once during that period, arriving mid-morning when sunlight filtered through the bare branches and cast striped shadows across the living room floor. She walked through each room quietly, not to supervise, but to remember. She paused in Ethan's old study, where a framed photograph of him at age 10 still sat on the bookshelf, baseball cap tilted backward, grin wide and fearless. She picked it up, brushed a thin layer of dust from the glass, and placed it gently into her handbag. Lindsay watched from the doorway, her expression no longer sharp, but unsettled. There were no arguments left to make. The paperwork had replaced them. On the 29th day, a moving truck backed into the driveway, its engine rumbling low as two uniformed workers carried out boxes marked kitchen and personal. The oak tree in the yard stood unmoved, its roots deep in soil that had never changed ownership. Margaret remained across town that afternoon, signing documents to establish a small scholarship fund in Ethan's name at the local community college, a gesture quiet and enduring. When the truck finally pulled away and the house stood empty except for its original furnishings, Margaret returned at dusk. She unlocked the front door with a key that had always been hers and stepped inside. The air was still. The walls held echoes, but not chaos. She walked to the center of the living room and stood there for a long moment, not triumphant, not bitter, simply steady. The house had not been defended with raised voices. It had been protected with foresight. And as the evening light faded across the hardwood floors she had once chosen down to the exact stain, Margaret understood that dignity does not demand recognition. It requires preparation. The first night Margaret Whitmore slept alone in the house again, the silence no longer felt hostile, it felt honest. She stood in the kitchen at 7:30 in the evening, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over the marble countertops, and listened to the steady hum of the refrigerator, the distant rush of a car passing at 30 miles per hour beyond the gates. There were no boxes left in the hallway, no unfamiliar perfume lingering in the air, no tense footsteps pacing across hardwood floors. She opened the cabinet above the stove and took down a single white plate, the same set she had purchased in a boxed collection years ago, choosing durability over decoration. Dinner was simple, soup warmed slowly on the stovetop, steam rising in soft curls that disappeared into the quiet ceiling. She carried the bowl to the dining table and sat in the chair she had always preferred, the one facing the oak tree outside the bay window. The branches were still bare, but small buds had begun to form, subtle signs of a season turning whether anyone noticed or not. Margaret ate without distraction, not rushing, not lingering. Afterward, she washed the bowl by hand and dried it carefully before placing it back in its exact position. Order had returned, not because she forced it, but because it belonged there. She walked through the house room by room, switching off unnecessary lights, straightening a picture frame that had shifted slightly during the moving process, adjusting the thermostat down by 2 degrees as the temperature dropped outside. In Ethan's former study, she opened the drawer of his desk and removed a small stack of letters he had written during college, folded neatly, the ink still dark and certain. She did not read them. She simply held them for a moment before returning them to their place. Grief no longer crashed over her in waves, it settled like a steady tide, predictable and survivable. The next morning, she rose at 6:45, brewed coffee in the same machine that had once prepared it for 3, and carried her mug onto the porch. The air measured 48 degrees, crisp but not biting, and the neighborhood moved slowly around her, joggers passing with measured strides, a school bus stopping at the corner. Margaret watched the world continue and understood that her own continuation was not defiance. It was alignment. Later that afternoon, she met with Daniel Brooks again to finalize the paperwork transferring utilities fully into her sole management and to confirm that all outstanding matters were closed. There were no disputes left, no pending claims. Everything stood exactly as it had been written. When she returned home, she parked in the driveway and paused before stepping out of the car, looking at the white facade of the house, the blue shutters clean against the sky. It did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a home that had weathered a storm without splintering. Margaret locked the car, walked up the front steps, and entered without hesitation. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as it always had. Inside, the house did not echo. It breathed. And in that quiet breath, she felt something stronger than victory. She felt permanence. Spring arrived gradually, not with spectacle but with evidence, and Margaret Whitmore noticed it first in the front yard where the oak tree that had stood through decades of seasons began to show small green leaves unfurling at the tips of its branches. The mornings warmed to 55 degrees, and she opened the kitchen windows an inch to let fresh air move through the rooms that had once felt crowded with tension. Sunlight stretched farther across the hardwood floors each afternoon, illuminating dust particles that drifted lazily rather than urgently. Margaret moved through the house with steady purpose, not redecorating, not erasing history, simply refining it. She replaced heavy winter curtains with lighter linen panels that allowed more light to enter. She rearranged the living room slightly, angling the armchair toward the window so she could read in natural light instead of relying on lamps. On a quiet Tuesday, she drove 20 minutes to the local nursery and selected 2 hydrangea bushes, pale blue, sturdy, and young. The employee helped load them into the trunk, and she drove home at a careful 25 miles per hour, mindful of every turn. In the afternoon, she planted them near the porch steps, pressing the soil down firmly with her hands, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Dirt gathered beneath her fingernails, and she did not rush to wash it away. It felt grounding. Later that week, she received a brief forwarded message from a mutual acquaintance mentioning that Lindsay had signed a lease on a smaller apartment closer to the city, that she had started a new job, that she was adjusting. Margaret read the message once and set her phone aside. There was no satisfaction in the update, only distance. That evening, she sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea as the temperature hovered near 62 degrees, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children ride bicycles along the quiet street. A breeze lifted the new leaves overhead, their soft rustle replacing the echoes that once filled the halls. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the yard that remained unchanged in ownership and intention. The house did not feel like a trophy. It felt like continuity. And as twilight settled gently over the white facade and blue shutters, she understood that what had been secured was not merely property, but peace earned through foresight, patience, and an unwavering refusal to be reduced to someone else's assumption. By early summer, the hydrangeas had bloomed fully, soft blue clusters resting against the white porch like quiet proof that time had continued exactly as it should. Margaret Whitmore stood at the edge of the yard one late afternoon, a watering hose in her hand, sunlight warming her shoulders at 74 degrees, and watched the neighborhood settle into its familiar rhythm. A sedan slowed near the curb before continuing down the street, its driver glancing briefly at the house that had once been the subject of whispers. Margaret turned off the water and coiled the hose carefully, looping it with the same precision she had once used when reviewing contracts across polished conference tables. Inside, the house felt balanced. The study remained intact, Ethan's photograph now framed in a simple silver border on the mantel rather than tucked away on a shelf. The scholarship fund in his name had already received its first applicant, a young man studying engineering who had written a letter about perseverance and responsibility. Margaret had read it twice, her expression thoughtful but steady. Later that evening, as dusk settled in soft shades of lavender and gold, she prepared a small dinner and set the table for one without hesitation. The chair across from her remained empty, but it no longer felt accusatory. It felt honest. Her phone buzzed briefly with a notification, a social media update from Lindsay announcing a new beginning in a smaller apartment overlooking the Hudson River. Margaret glanced at the message, noted the brightness of the accompanying photograph, and set the phone face down on the table. There was no resentment left to process. Only distance. After dinner, she stepped onto the porch once more, folding a light sweater around her shoulders as the temperature dipped to 68 degrees. Fireflies flickered faintly near the hedges, and the oak tree's leaves rustled with quiet assurance. The house stood unchanged, its foundation steady beneath the evening sky. Margaret rested her hand against the porch railing, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm. She had not argued. She had not retaliated. She had simply remained prepared. In the stillness of that summer night, with the windows open and the scent of cut grass drifting through the air, she understood something simple and enduring. She had not won against anyone. She had protected what was hers. And in doing so, she had protected herself. In late July, the house hosted guests again, not for mourning but for purpose, as Margaret Whitmore arranged a small gathering on the porch to announce the official launch of the Ethan Whitmore Memorial Scholarship. The afternoon air measured 82 degrees, warm but softened by a steady breeze that moved through the oak tree and carried the scent of fresh lemonade across the lawn. Folding chairs were set in 2 neat rows facing the porch steps, and a modest wooden podium stood near the hydrangeas that had grown fuller since spring. Margaret wore a simple navy dress and low heels, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her posture calm and unforced. Neighbors, a few former colleagues, and the first scholarship recipient stood quietly, programs in hand. When Margaret stepped forward to speak, she did not raise her voice beyond what was necessary. She spoke of discipline, responsibility, and the quiet strength of planning ahead. She did not mention disputes or misunderstandings. She did not mention whispers. Instead, she described Ethan as a man who believed in building foundations that lasted beyond immediate comfort. The young recipient, standing 6 feet tall and nervous in a pressed button-down shirt, thanked her with a steady handshake and promised to honor the opportunity. Applause rose naturally, not dramatic, not forced, simply sincere. From across the street, a parked car idled for a moment before driving away, its tinted windows revealing nothing. Margaret noticed but did not react. After the brief ceremony, guests lingered, sipping iced tea and commenting on how well the yard looked, how peaceful the house felt. Margaret moved among them with measured ease, accepting thanks with a nod, redirecting praise toward Ethan's memory. As the sun dipped lower and the temperature eased to 76 degrees, chairs were folded and carried inside. The porch returned to stillness. Margaret remained alone for a moment, looking at the podium now resting against the wall. She touched the smooth wood once, then turned her gaze toward the open lawn stretching beyond the driveway. There had been no courtroom battles, no public confrontations, no raised voices echoing through these walls. There had been only foresight, documentation, and restraint. She stepped down from the porch and walked along the stone path, her heels steady against the ground she had secured long before anyone questioned her place upon it. The house behind her stood illuminated by the fading light, not as a symbol of victory, but as proof that dignity, when prepared carefully and defended quietly, does not fade with grief. It endures. By early September, the air shifted again, cooler in the mornings, hovering near 60 degrees as Margaret Whitmore stepped onto the porch with her coffee and watched a thin layer of mist lift from the lawn. The hydrangeas had begun to soften in color, their blue fading into pale green, and the oak tree overhead carried a hint of gold along its outer leaves. Change no longer startled her. It arrived, it adjusted, it settled. Inside the house, the study window stood slightly open, allowing a quiet breeze to move the curtains just enough to suggest motion without disturbance. On the desk rested a small stack of thank you letters from the scholarship committee, detailing the recipient's progress during his first weeks of classes. Margaret read each letter carefully, her eyes steady, her expression thoughtful rather than sentimental. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang once, clear and unhurried. She walked to the front entrance and opened it to find Lindsay standing on the porch, dressed simply, her posture less rigid than before. There was no dramatic tension in the air, only the weight of unfinished distance. Lindsay explained that she had come to retrieve a final box mistakenly left in the garage, her tone controlled, almost restrained. Margaret stepped aside without hesitation and allowed her to enter. They walked together through the quiet hallway, past the framed photographs and the polished floors that reflected afternoon light. In the garage, the box sat near the back wall, labeled in faded marker. Lindsay lifted it carefully, avoiding eye contact at first. Then, as she turned toward the door, she paused and offered a brief acknowledgement, not an apology in elaborate words, but a recognition of clarity. Margaret responded with a nod, neither inviting conversation nor closing it entirely. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. When Lindsay drove away, at a slow 20 miles per hour, the street returned to its usual calm. Margaret closed the garage door and walked back inside, her steps measured and quiet. She did not replay the funeral. She did not revisit the whispers. The house felt unchanged by the visit, as solid as ever. She returned to the study, adjusted the stack of letters on the desk, and looked once more out the window at the yard that had weathered every season without collapse. The encounter had not unsettled her. It had confirmed something simpler. Preparation had replaced confrontation. Documentation had replaced doubt. And in the gentle light of early autumn filtering through the oak leaves, Margaret understood that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the result of standing firm long before conflict arrives. By late October, the oak tree stood in full amber, its leaves drifting down in quiet spirals that gathered along the stone walkway Margaret Whitmore swept each morning with steady, unhurried strokes. The air carried a crisp 58 degrees at sunrise, cool enough to warrant a wool coat, light enough to breathe deeply without resistance. Inside, the house reflected the season without excess. A simple wreath hung on the front door. A candle warmed the living room with a faint scent of cedar and apple. Margaret moved through each room with the familiarity of someone who did not need to assert ownership because it had long been established. On the mantel, Ethan's photograph remained centered, not as a shrine but as a reminder of continuity. The scholarship fund had awarded its first semester stipend, and a handwritten note from the recipient rested beside the frame, thanking her for believing in preparation over impulse. One quiet afternoon, Margaret drove to the cemetery, parking carefully along the gravel path and walking the remaining 50 yards with measured steps. She carried a small bouquet of white roses, placing them gently at the headstone. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices to the sky. She stood there for a moment, gloved hands folded, speaking softly about the scholarship, about the hydrangeas blooming and fading as they should, about the house remaining steady through summer storms and early autumn winds. When she returned home, she paused in the driveway and looked at the white facade against the gray October sky. The windows reflected clouds moving steadily overhead, indifferent yet constant. Inside, she brewed tea and sat at the dining table, reviewing household accounts with the same care she had always applied, every number aligned, every document filed. Nothing had been taken from her that she had not already prepared to protect. The whispers from months ago no longer echoed in her memory. They had dissolved under the weight of signed papers and quiet resolve. As evening settled and the temperature dipped toward 50 degrees, Margaret turned on the porch light and stepped outside one final time. Leaves rustled across the lawn, and somewhere in the distance a car passed at a slow, steady pace. She rested her hand against the porch railing, feeling the cool wood beneath her palm. The house stood behind her, unchanged in structure, strengthened in meaning. She had not needed to retaliate. She had not needed to explain. She had remained composed, documented, and prepared. In the stillness of that autumn night, Margaret understood that she had not won against anyone. She had simply refused to be diminished. And in refusing, she had secured something far greater than property. She had secured herself.